History books used to say that Hitler's greatest mistake in deciding to invade the Soviet Union was underestimating the spirit of the Soviet people, the advantages of the socialist system, and the leading role of the Communist Party. Let's look at the key mistakes made by the German leadership that led to Germany's defeat in the Second World War. Already in September 1941, Hitler said he would not have attacked the Soviet Union had he known earlier how many tanks the Red Army possessed. A review of German planning documents for war against the Soviet Union reveals the Wehrmacht leadership's striking ignorance about the state of Soviet forces. German intelligence failed to provide reliable information on two fundamental points: the exact composition of the Soviet Union's armed forces and its potential for mobilization. The Army High Command assumed that in the summer of 1941, the Red Army had over 150 infantry divisions, 36 motorized brigades, and 32 cavalry divisions. 1/5 of the total force, it believed, was in the south and east, and thus unavailable against the Wehrmacht. German generals thought the Red Army could field up to 5,000 combat aircraft, and assumed it had nearly 10,000 tanks.
A famous line from Winston Churchill, he said he would be ready to become a communist to have 10,000 tanks, fits here rather well. In 1941, no one believed there was an army in the world with that many tanks. As of June 1, 1941, the Red Army had 25,482 tanks, 5,260 armored cars, and 18,914 aircraft. In the western part of the country alone, there were 13,000 tanks, more than 2,000 armored vehicles, and 8,974 combat aircraft concentrated. Another fact underscoring German intelligence failures was the claim that the Red Army had 36 motorized brigades and mechanized corps, made up of 2 mechanized brigades plus a rifle and machine gun brigade. In reality, in 1941, there were no brigades of that kind, but rather 29 mechanized corps, each with 2 tank divisions, 1 motorized division, and even a motorcycle regiment, whose existence the Germans did not even suspect. In total, at the start of the war, the Red Army comprised 303 divisions, 177 infantry divisions, 2 motorized divisions, 19 mountain divisions, 9 cavalry divisions, 4 mountain cavalry divisions, 31 motorized divisions, and 61 tank divisions. The German leadership knew nothing about 7 Soviet second echelon armies that moved up to the frontier in June. Thus, when the forces of the Western Front were defeated on schedule and the road to Moscow seemed open, the Wehrmacht ran into those second echelon forces. To these were added armies formed from units of the Soviet Union's Ministry of Internal Affairs and later the People's Militia. The German plan assumed that speed would substitute for depth. In practice, space fought back. Roads beyond the frontier were often unpaved. Summer dust turned to autumn mud. Bridges were blown, and rail lines had the wrong gauge. Every advance lengthened supply columns and forced engineers to relay tracks behind the panzer spearheads. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts arrived through few, overstretched choke points that partisans learned to hit. Jerry cans and captured Soviet stocks helped, but not enough to keep the planned pace. Repair units lacked time and spares to cycle damaged vehicles back into action. Battalions bled strength even while advancing. What German calculations treated as tolerable friction, gaps in railheads, delays at river crossings, one more blown culvert, aggregated into operational drag. By late summer, many divisions were moving less like a knife and more like a heavy saw, still cutting, but with effort, pauses, and rising cost in fuel and hours. In a blitzkrieg, time is a weapon. Here, the Red Army and the landscape were taking it away. The greatest mistake, however, was underestimating the Soviet Union's mobilization capacity. In February 1941, a report by the future General Paulus stated that the Red Army could raise 30 additional reserve divisions in the first months of war, and as many as another 100 within 6 months. At the same time, the Wehrmacht leadership doubted the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had enough weapons to equip new formations. Yet after Soviet forces in Belarus and the Baltic states were defeated in the summer of 1941, the Soviet Union began forming new divisions en masse. First, the capacity of the armaments industry had been underestimated. Second, the Germans encountered internal reserves they had not accounted for. According to a Soviet People's Commissariat of Defense memorandum, on the mobilization deployment of the Red Army, dated February 12, 1941, reserves included about 2 million rifles, up to 20,000 machine guns, 15,000 mortars, 5,000 76mm field and mountain guns, and 1,500 heavy guns. And that was only standard equipment. There were also obsolete and foreign weapons.
Veterans' post-war memoirs often note that during the fighting for Moscow, there was a shortage of artillery shells, caused by poor organization of resupply. Dozens of newly formed divisions received non-standard armament: German, British, Czech, and French guns, rifles, and machine guns. One of the divisions defending Moscow, for example, was armed with French 75mm guns of the 1897 model. Hundreds sat in depots, but there was a shortage of ammunition. Ideological misreadings also played a major role in Germany's defeat. Hitler mistakenly assumed that the majority of the Soviet population opposed Bolshevik rule and would rise up once war broke out. He also misjudged the mood of the Soviet leadership, believing that after the first military setbacks, a coup would occur in the land of the Soviets. Germany entirely misjudged the social situation in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The majority of the population supported the government in power and Stalin. It should not be overlooked that the notorious Red Terror of the 1930s, in several respects, inoculated the Soviet Union against rebellion. In the first weeks of the invasion, the German advance reached depths of up to 30 kilometers. Yet despite the complete destruction of many Red Army divisions in the first days, the German leadership, within the framework of Operation Barbarossa, overestimated its own strength. The Red Army's toughness, desperation, and organized resistance proved far greater than expected. The Wehrmacht's hopes of defeating the Red Army in border battles and meeting no serious resistance beyond them were not borne out. After the first engagements in the Soviet Union, many Wehrmacht soldiers, confronted with the heroism of Soviet soldiers, began to respect the Russians. It was clear they would not defend a bad country to the bitter end if it truly were one. Letters home from corporals and captains alike began to sound the same: surprise at Soviet scale, frustration at distances, and a grudging respect for opponents who refused to be finished. The tone shifted from certainty to endurance. Units wrote that after an encirclement, there was always another line, after a march, another river. The disappointment was not theatrical, it was practical. The campaign many had expected to be decided by shock and tempo was turning into a contest of replacement, repair, and will. That realization, arriving before the snow, was the first real crack in the promise of a quick victory. The courage of Soviet soldiers dispelled many myths of Goebbels's propaganda machine. German soldiers wrote in diaries and letters home that they had never imagined such an outcome for the campaign in Russia. It was not only rankers and junior officers who realized the notion of a quick victory was false. Generals were no less categorical. Major General Hoffmann von Waldau, serving in a high Luftwaffe command post, wrote, "The level of training of Soviet pilots is far higher than expected. The stubborn resistance on a massive scale is in complete contradiction to our original assumptions." His words were borne out by facts. On the first day of the war, the Luftwaffe lost up to 300 aircraft. Already on June 22, 1941, Soviet pilots began ramming German planes, which genuinely shocked German airmen. Never before had the Luftwaffe of the Third Reich, Hitler's pride and hope, suffered such staggering losses. By late 1941, disappointment had a concrete shape. The enemy was larger than expected, the space deeper, and the war longer. Blitzkrieg assumptions cracked, not only on Soviet armor and industry, but on roads, rail gauge, time, and will. That gap between plan and reality is what German soldiers felt first, and what the German command understood too late.